Wounded and bleeding in that dry canyon, she would have died, and the rancher who saved her had no idea what saving her life would change his forever. Her name was Tahnee. His was Samuel Hart. They came from worlds that the Arizona Territory of 1884 had worked very hard to keep apart, and what began with a woman left for dead in the dust of Apache Pass would end with 40 mounted warriors surrounding his ranch at sunrise, and a gentleman standing alone in his doorway, wondering whether he was about to die or whether something he had never expected was about to begin. Watch this one until the end. You won't want to miss how it turns out. If stories like this one mean something to you, please like and subscribe. It keeps them coming. The land around Dos Cabezas in the summer of 1884 was the kind of country that didn't ask your opinion. It was hard granite and creosote and dry washes that could fill with 10 feet of brown water in an hour and be bone dry by morning. The Dos Cabezas peaks rose in the east like a pair of fists. Apache Pass cut through the range a few miles south, and the Chiricahua Apache bands had moved through that country for generations and didn't intend to stop for anyone. Samuel Hart had come here 3 years prior, after his wife Clara died in childbirth in Missouri, and took the baby with her. He'd been looking for somewhere that didn't have Clara's shape pressed into every doorframe and bend in the road. The Arizona Territory had nothing of hers in it. That was what he needed. He was 31. He had brown eyes, a few weeks of beard, and hands that showed every kind of work he'd put them to. He ran about 60 head of cattle on 140 acres south of the Dos Cabezas mountains, had a good spring that hadn't gone dry in 3 summers, and had built himself a 2-room adobe with a covered porch and a stone-walled corral he was quietly proud of. The quiet had become a habit. In Missouri, he'd been the kind of man who came home to noise and warmth, who had someone to talk through the day with. In Arizona, he kept what he thought to himself and let the land fill the space words used to take up. He wasn't unhappy. He wasn't happy either. His nearest town was a small supply settlement 7 miles west. He went there for flour and ammunition and came back as soon as he could. The men there weren't all bad, but they held the territory's opinions on the Apache, and those opinions ran dark. The Army had been pushing the Chiricahua onto the San Carlos Reservation for years. Low desert scrub that bore no resemblance to the mountain country the Chiricahua knew and lived from. The ones who refused were called hostile by newspapers and something worse by the men in town. Samuel didn't carry those opinions. He'd never had trouble with any Apache in 3 years on that land. He'd tipped his hat once to a group of women and children crossing through the mesquite and ridden home without mentioning it. He was moving his small herd south along the canyon rim on the 4th of August when he saw the vultures. There were 7 of them, big black turkey vultures, wheeling in a slow, patient circle over a bend in the canyon below him about a 1/4 mile east. 2 were already down, which meant whatever they'd found was very recently dead or very nearly so. Samuel had seen vultures all his life and knew the difference between a circling that was patient and a circling that was urgent. This was urgent. They were dropping. He turned his horse and went to see. He found her lying half in and half out of a dry streambed, in the shadow of a fractured granite overhang. She was Apache. He could tell that immediately from her dress, a calico blouse and buckskin skirt, moccasins with the turned-up Chiricahua toe. She was young, 20, maybe 22. Her black hair was loose from its braid and fanned out in the dust around her head. She had a wound in her left side, below the ribs. A deep knife cut, from the look of it, not a bullet, and a second wound across her upper arm that might have been made by either. Both had clotted over, but the clots were dark and old. She'd been here a while. Her lips were cracked open from the heat. One of the vultures was 3 feet from her head when Samuel rode down the canyon side. He shouted, and the bird lumbered off, and he was down from his horse before it fully stopped moving. He crouched over her and put 2 fingers to the side of her throat, the way he'd been taught years ago by a man who'd done a little medicine in the war. There was a pulse, not strong, but there. He looked around the canyon. There were signs of horses, several sets of hoofprints in the dust of the stream, boots and unshod horses both, and shell casings glinting near the rocks that he hadn't noticed until he was looking. Something had happened here, something recent and bad, but whoever had done it was gone, and she was still breathing. He got water from his canteen into her, a small amount at a time, tipping it carefully past her cracked lips. She stirred. Her eyes opened. They were dark and completely clear, in the way eyes sometimes are when a person is too worn out to be afraid of anything anymore. She looked at him and at the sky and at the canyon rim, taking stock. Then she said something in Chiricahua Apache, a short phrase, low and flat. He didn't know the language. He said in English, "I've got you. You're not alone." She didn't respond to the words, but she looked at his face for a long moment, and something in her expression settled very slightly, as though she'd made a decision. He couldn't leave her and he couldn't send for help from here. Town was 7 miles west, his ranch 1.5 miles north. He tore a strip from the cleanest cloth he had in his saddlebag and pressed it carefully against her side, and she made no sound while he did it, holding herself very still in the way he was beginning to recognize as a particular kind of discipline. He got her onto his horse in front of him. She weighed almost nothing, which frightened him, and he rode back to his ranch as carefully as he'd ever ridden. He got her inside and onto his rope bed in the back room and sent up a prayer to whoever was listening that he could manage what came next. He could, barely. He'd seen wound work in Missouri during the tail end of the war. He was young then, but memory didn't always need you to be old. He cleaned both wounds with the boiled water and whiskey he kept for exactly this kind of emergency and nobody ever actually wanting to use. The knife wound was deep, and he had to close it with the curved needle he used for harness. Repair and thread he boiled in the pot first, working by the light of 2 candles because the sun was down now. She watched what he was doing the whole time. She never made a sound that wasn't controlled. He told her what he was going to do before he did it, not because he knew she understood, but because he thought it mattered to treat her like someone who had a right to know. She had a fever by midnight. He sat with her the first night, dozing in the chair, waking when she moved. He got water into her when she was conscious enough to take it, got some broth into her the second morning from the pot he'd put on, and kept the wounds clean. She slipped in and out of something that wasn't quite sleep. Sometimes her lips moved, sometimes she said words he couldn't follow. Once she said something very clearly, and with force, like a name or a command, and then came back to herself and found him watching her, and looked at him steadily until he looked away first. He rode into town on the second morning to get medicine from the settlement's one man who called himself a doctor, a generous title. But the man had laudanum and clean carbolic and suturing gut, which was more than Samuel had. He bought what he needed and didn't say what it was for, but he was Samuel Hart and they knew him, and they noticed the blood still on his shirt that he'd forgotten to change. The doctor, a heavy man named Tibbs who had come from Ohio and never quite acclimatized, stopped him on his way out. "You've got someone hurt," Tibbs said. "Not a question." "Yeah, Apache woman. Someone saw you come in from the South Canyon yesterday." Samuel looked at him. "I'd think carefully," Tibbs said, not unkindly. "Harboring a hostile, that's what they'll call it." "She's not hostile," Samuel said. "She's 20 years old, and she's been stabbed twice and left to die in the canyon. That's not how it'll be described." "No," Samuel said. "I don't suppose it will." He bought a second tin of carbolic in case and rode home. 2 men from town came out that afternoon. He heard their horses in the yard and went out to meet them on the porch. They were not bad men. He knew their names, had shared meals with one of them. They told him what he already understood, that keeping an Apache woman on his property was going to cause him problems, that the army would hear about it, that the town was uneasy, that there were people who might decide to make something of it. Samuel listened to all of it. He said, "She didn't have a choice about where she ended up bleeding in that canyon. I'm not going to finish the job whoever did that to her started." He said it without heat, which was worse than if he'd shouted, because it meant he wasn't going to be argued out of it. They rode back to town. He went inside. She was awake when he came in. She'd pulled herself upright against the wall, which she absolutely should not have done with that side wound. And she was looking at the door. She had found the knife he kept on the shelf by the window. He didn't know how. He hadn't seen her move. And she was holding it with the easy grip of someone who knew what it was for. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the knife. He looked at her. "Those men are gone," he said. "I sent them away." She watched him. "I'm not going to turn you over to anybody," he said. He walked across to the chair and sat down and poured himself a cup of cold coffee from the pot on the table and didn't look at her again. giving her the space to decide what she thought about him. After a while, she set the knife down on the blanket beside her. She didn't let go of it. But she set it down. That was the third day. She was Tahnee. He learned her name because she told him 2 days later, when the fever had broken, and she was strong enough to sit up on her own and eat the flat bread he'd made on the griddle without him needing to help her hold it. She said it clearly, touching her own chest. Tahnee. And he repeated it, probably imperfectly. And she made a small correction with her lips, showing the sound he'd missed. And he tried again. And she looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. He told her his name. Samuel. He touched his chest. Samuel, she said, and the way she put the emphasis on the second half made it sound different than he was used to, but he liked it. She was fiercely intelligent. He understood that within a day of her being well enough to have a personality. She watched everything he did with complete attention, the way he moved around the kitchen, how he built up the fire, how he handled the horses in the corral through the back window. She didn't do this in a way that felt like surveillance. It was more like she was learning a place the way a careful person learns any new place. The exits, the rhythms, what was safe and what wasn't. She spoke no English. He spoke no Chiricahua Apache. Communication was slow and built on repetition and gesture, and eventually, on about 30 words they managed to hammer out together between her language and his. He pointed at things. She gave him the Apache word. He gave her the English one. She was faster at learning his than he was at learning hers, which she didn't make him feel bad about, though he suspected she noticed. He had not been around a woman in 3 years. He found that her presence in his house changed the quality of the air in it. Not in any way he could describe, not romantically at first, but the way any living presence changes a space that's been empty. He cooked with more care. He put an actual cloth on the table. He noticed that there were no curtains on the window in the back room and found an old piece of canvas he washed and tacked up over it, not because she asked, but because it seemed like the right thing. She recovered in stages. The side wound was the worrying one. And he kept it clean and watched it carefully, and it was Tahnee herself who seemed to know the moment the danger was past. One morning she pressed along the closed skin with 2 fingers and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at him and said something in Apache that he understood from her tone to be, "It's going to be all right." He let out a breath he'd been holding for days. On the 6th morning she was up before him, moving around the kitchen with careful but steady steps. She had found the cornmeal and the salt and the pot, and she was making something at the stove with the concentration of a person who needed to be doing something with her hands. He stood in the doorway and watched her. She knew he was there. She didn't acknowledge him for a moment. And then she said something in Apache and gestured at the table, which he understood to mean sit down. He sat down. She set a bowl in front of him. It was corn porridge. Nothing complicated, but it was seasoned with something he didn't have a name for. Some dried herb she'd found in the bundle she'd been carrying when he found her, and it tasted entirely different from the plain meal he'd been making for 3 years. He ate all of it. She sat across from him and ate her own portion, and he noticed that she held herself very straight, spine easy and upright, with a kind of natural dignity that had nothing performing in it. She had braided her hair again this morning, 2 plaits, and she wore the blanket wrap over the calico blouse. She looked very young and very self-possessed at the same time. He said, "This is good." She knew that one. "Thank you," she said in English, trying out the phrase he'd taught her. Then she went back to eating, as though she hadn't just said something remarkable. In the evenings they sat on the covered porch when the heat broke. The Dos Cabezas peaks turned purple at sunset, and the creosote smell sharpened in the cooling air, and the stars in this country came out so thick and low they looked like something you could put your hand through. He told her about Missouri, not because she understood the words, but because the rhythm of talking to someone, the shape of being heard, was something he'd been missing for 3 years without knowing how much he missed it. She listened. She asked him questions in Apache, and he answered in English, and they were probably not answering each other, but they were speaking, which was its own kind of thing. She told him about her band and her family. He understood pieces of it. Her father, a man she named with particular care, a headman among the southern Chiricahua. Her mother, who had died the previous winter. A brother who was somewhere north. and the men who had attacked her family's small camp in the canyon, white outlaws, she managed to communicate, 2 or 3 of them who had come demanding something her father refused to give, and who had not taken the refusal well. A spring, she said, or he thought she said from the word and the gesture she made with her hands, cupped and flowing. A sacred water source, hidden in a canyon southeast of his land. The outlaws knew it was there and wanted it, and her family's refusal to give them access to it was why she'd been left bleeding in the dry streambed. He listened to all of this with a tightening in his chest that had to do with rage and with something else he didn't name yet. On the 9th morning, he woke before dawn to the sound of horses, not 1 or 2 horses, many, more than he'd heard at one time outside of a cattle drive. He lay still for a moment, listening to the hoofbeats slow and then stop, and then to the particular silence that follows a large group of riders when they come to a halt. He rose from his bedroll on the floor of the front room. He had given Tahnee the bed and went to the window. The first light was just starting in the east, a thin gray line over the Dos Cabezas peaks, and in that first pale light, across his yard and his corral and the mesquite flat beyond his fence line, there were warriors. He counted, he lost count. He counted again, 40, maybe more, mounted on good horses, armed, rifles, bows, the distinctive Chiricahua-style bandoliers, and arranged in a wide arc around the front and sides of his property. They were completely still. They made no sound. The horses were still too, which told him these men knew their animals the way a serious fighting force knows everything it rides. He stood at the window for a long moment. Then he went to the back room and pushed open the door. Tahnee was already awake. She was sitting up on the bed, and she was looking toward the window as though she'd heard the horses in her sleep and had been waiting. Her expression was not afraid. It was the careful expression of someone who already knew what was happening. She met his eyes. She said something quiet in Apache, a single sentence, and then she stood and reached for her blanket wrap and wrapped it around her shoulders. Samuel said, "Do you know them?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, very deliberately, the English word she'd learned for family. "Family." He nodded. He took a breath. He got his hat. He got his rifle, not because he intended to use it, but because walking out unarmed in front of 40 warriors when you were a white man on disputed land seemed like a different kind of statement than he wanted to make. He checked that his right hand was nowhere near the trigger. He opened the front door and walked out onto the porch alone. The gray light had grown. He could see them clearly now. 43, he counted, sitting their horses in the cold morning air with the patience of men who had been doing this kind of thing for a long time. The man at the center of the arc was older than the others, perhaps 60, with a face like the canyon country itself, weathered and composed and carrying a long memory. He wore no hat. His hair was silver at the temples. He sat his horse with a stillness that was not passivity, but something closer to authority, the specific gravity of a man whom others watched to know how they should move. Samuel stood on his porch and didn't speak. He knew in his bones that this was not the moment for talking. This was the moment for standing still and letting himself be read. The old man looked at him. Not through him, not past him, at him the way a serious man looks when he's arriving at a judgment. Then the front door opened behind Samuel and Tahnee came out onto the porch. She said something in Apache, a greeting, formal and precise, and the old man answered, and his voice had broken open, just slightly, in a way that a careful man's voice does when he sees something he was not certain he would see again. He answered her, and she answered him. And there was a conversation Samuel could not follow that lasted perhaps a minute and a half, and at the end of it the old man looked at Samuel again. Samuel met his eyes. The old man spoke in Apache, something deliberate, and Tahnee translated it into the broken English and gesture that was their shared language. Her father, this was her father, Karuk, headman of this band, her father had been 3 days finding her, tracking from the canyon where the attack had happened, following the signs north to Samuel's land. He had come expecting to find her dead or in chains. He had found her alive and standing on the porch of a white man's house in her own blanket wrap, and she had not been afraid, and her wounds were clean. The old man spoke again. Tahnee listened and turned to Samuel and said with careful English, he asked, "Why?" Samuel looked at Karuk. He said, "Because she was dying and I could stop it. I didn't need any other reason." Tahnee translated. The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke again, and Tahnee translated. He asked, "The men in your town, they did not want you to do this." "No," Samuel said. "They didn't. You did it anyway." "Yes." The old man looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached to the side of his belt and drew something, a knife, bone-handled, with a blade about 8 inches long, in a beaded leather sheath. He held it out. One of the younger warriors at his shoulder rode forward and extended the knife toward Samuel, hilt first, and stopped his horse 5 feet from the porch. Tahnee said, "Honor gift. My father's father made this knife. My father carries it since he was a young man." She looked at Samuel steadily. "He gives it to you." Samuel reached out and took the knife from the young warrior's hand. He turned it over once. The bone handle was worn smooth with decades of use. The beadwork on the sheath was fine and intricate, red and blue and white, the work of many careful hours. He looked up at Chiricahua. He pressed his right fist against his chest and held it there for a moment, which was the closest thing he had to making this formal in any way that crossed the language gap. Chiricahua looked at him. He said something in Apache, and this time he said it to Tahnee with a gentleness that was not a command, she said. He says, "You may come to our camp, you may trade, you may cross our land to the South Spring." She paused. "He says you are not like most." Samuel nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak for a moment. The warriors held for a little longer, not a threat, but a presence. The weight of 40 lives and the history behind them pressing into the morning air. And then Chiricahua turned his horse, and one by one the others followed, and the arc dissolved back into the mesquite and the gray light of early morning. In 30 seconds the yard was empty. Samuel and Tahnee stood on the porch and listened to the hoofbeats fade north, and when they were gone the silence felt enormous. He looked down at the knife in his hand. He looked at her. She was watching him with that careful, precise attention she gave to things she was making up her mind about. She said something in Apache, quietly, just for him, and he didn't know the words. But he knew what it felt like when someone told you that you had done something that mattered. He put the knife in his belt. Carefully, he said, "I'm going to put the coffee on." She followed him inside. In the days that followed, the weight of what had happened settled into something quieter and more solid. Tahnee was well enough now to move freely around the property, and she did, with the thoroughness of someone learning a place she might need to know well. She walked his fence line with him one morning and pointed out where the posts were working loose from the caliche. 3 places he'd been meaning to fix for months. She looked at his kitchen garden, a sorry thing of half-dead tomatoes and struggling squash, and came back with something to say about it that he couldn't understand. But the next day she dug up a section near the south wall, where the sun hit longest, and started over, and in 2 weeks that section was producing better than the rest. She showed him the dried herbs and medicines she carried, identified by scent and touch, the accumulated learning of people who had lived in this country for generations before any wagon road existed. She showed him which plants in the canyon draws were good for fever, which for wounds, which to store for winter. He tried to remember all of it. He got maybe half. He told her about Clara. He'd never talked about it much, not to anyone. Because in Missouri everyone had known, and in Arizona no one had asked. But sitting at the table one evening, with the oil lamp going and the moths hitting the window glass outside, he told her about the house in Missouri and the plans he'd had for it, and the morning he'd come back from the field to find that everything had changed. He talked for a while. She listened to all of it, not understanding the words but understanding the shape of what he was saying. Because grief has a shape that doesn't need translation. When he was done, she reached across the table and put her hand on his for a moment, briefly, and then she took it back. Neither of them said anything. He understood that night that something was happening between them that he did not have a name for yet and did not need to rush toward. It was enough for now that it was there. He was right to take his time. 5 days later, the outlaws came back. There were 3 of them. He found out their names afterward, from a marshal who came through the territory the following month, but in the moment they were just 3 men on horseback who rode up to his fence line in the middle of the day while Tahnee was in the kitchen, and he was working the corral. He recognized one of them from the shell casings he'd seen in the canyon. The one doing the talking was maybe 45, with a beard and the particular brand of confidence that belongs to men who are used to not being told no. The man's name, he learned later, was Creech. He sold water rights and land access to mining outfits, and the spring in the canyon southeast of Samuel's land was worth a great deal to the right buyer. The attack on Tahnee's family was meant to be persuasion. He told Samuel all of this without much preamble, having decided Samuel was the kind of man who understood practical arrangements. "The girl's staying here," Samuel said when the man was done. "That's not what I asked. It's what I'm answering." He stood at the corral gate with his hands easy at his sides. "She's not going anywhere. And whatever that spring means to her family, it's going to stay their business." Creech looked at the man beside him, the look of someone confirming that he was having the conversation he thought he was having, and then he looked back at Samuel. "You understand what kind of trouble that makes?" "I do," Samuel said. "I'm not sure you do." He said this in the same quiet voice he'd used all morning, which was the same voice he used for everything, and he meant it exactly as stated. And Creech read something in his face that was maybe the knife on his belt, or the rifle leaned against the corral post within easy reach, or something else in his expression. And after a moment, Creech turned his horse and they rode back south the way they'd come. Samuel went inside. He told Tahnee what had happened. She listened, and her face went very still, not afraid but focused, in the way it got when she was thinking something through. She asked him questions in Apache that he answered in English, neither of them fully understanding the other, but both of them managing anyway, which was a small ordinary miracle they had stopped being surprised by. That evening she told him, in careful English and gesture, that she needed to get word to her father. She could leave, she was well enough to travel now, and she said so plainly. He did not try to talk her out of it, he asked if she would come back. She looked at him for a moment with those dark clear eyes. She said, "Yes." He nodded. He saddled one of his horses for her, the sorrel, which was calm and easy-gaited. And she looked at the horse, and looked at him, and said something in Apache that he thought was both thank you and something additional, something longer, and then she rode north toward the mountains in the last light of the day. She came back 2 days later at dusk, riding in from the north through the Mesquite Flat. She had her father's answer. Karuk and 6 of his warriors would be at the canyon the following morning. The 3 of them, Samuel, Tahnee, and Karuk with 6 of his band, arrived at the narrow South Canyon at first light. Creech was there. He'd brought 4 men. He looked at the Apache warriors, and he looked at Samuel, and he made a calculation that was visible on his face. This had gotten more complicated than he'd planned for. What happened next was not a fight. Tahnee made sure of that. She stood between the 2 groups and spoke first to her father, gesturing toward the canyon, the spring, the territory. She spoke with the precision of someone who had been thinking through this conversation for days. Then she turned to Creech and said, in English that was simple and exact, "This water is ours, has been ours, will be ours, you will not have it." Creech looked at Samuel. Samuel said, "You heard her." There were 6 Apache warriors behind Tahnee and her father, and they were very still in the way the 40 had been still at his ranch that morning 2 weeks ago, with the specific patience of men who had been in this country since long before any of the current arguments started. And there was Samuel Hart beside them, which was not nothing either, a white rancher with a marshal's contact in his saddlebag, and a bone handle, knife on his belt, and 3 years of clean standing in the territory. Creech made his calculation again. He turned his horse. His 4 men followed. Tahnee watched them go until they were out of the canyon. Then she let out a breath that was not quite relief, not quite pride, something between them. Karuk said something to her, and she laughed, just briefly, and then caught herself and looked at Samuel and translated. "He says you are very still when there is danger. He says this is a good thing." "He's seen more danger than I have," Samuel said. She translated. Karuk looked at Samuel for a moment, and then something in the old man's face shifted very slightly. Not a smile exactly, but a look of the kind of approval that a man who doesn't give it easily means when he gives it. They rode back to Samuel's ranch in the middle of the afternoon, and Tahnee's father and his men stayed through the evening. Samuel cooked what he had, which wasn't much but was offered without reservation, and Karuk accepted it in the same spirit. They sat outside while the last of the day cooled down, and Tahnee moved between them, translating when the conversation required it, and not bothering when everyone was comfortable in the quiet. The Dos Cabezas peaks went orange, and then purple, and then dark while they sat there, a rancher and an Apache headman, and the woman who stood between their worlds. and the sound of the horses in the corral and the first crickets in the mesquite, and nothing else for miles. The warriors made their camp north of his fence line that night and were gone before sunrise. Tahnee stayed. The weeks after that moved differently than the weeks before. The hard part, the life and death part, the fear part, was behind them. And what was left was the daily ordinary texture of two people who had decided to keep choosing toward each other. She was not a guest anymore, and she was not his patient. She was something the English language of 1884 didn't have a clean word for, because the situation itself didn't have a category in the world they'd both grown up in. She brought her things from her family's camp, not much. A bundle of her own carefully wrapped medicines, a basket she was working on in the traditional way, flat weave and intricate pattern, that she worked on in the evenings, with the particular focused calm of someone doing a thing they learned young in love. He watched her hands sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. He was usually wrong. He started learning Apache in a more organized way, making a small notebook of words and their meanings that he kept in his vest pocket. She corrected him when he got the sounds wrong, which was often. She was patient about it in a way that he suspected wasn't entirely natural to her. He'd seen her impatience when she was frustrated with herself, the way she'd press her lips together and start over from the beginning without making a display of it. But with him she was generous. He learned that her mother had been the band's best basbec maker. He learned she had a younger sister at the family camp, that she could track better than he could ride, and that she had a quiet contempt for the flat bread he made on the griddle, which she improved every time he left her near the kitchen. She learned that he talked to his horses. She learned he'd built the adobe himself and was proud of it, and tried not to show it. She looked through his small shelf of books with careful attention, asking by gesture how the symbols made sounds, how the sounds made meaning. He tried to explain reading. It took 2 evenings and she decided she would learn it, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a decision already made. September arrived, and the heat broke slowly, and the canyon country turned a dozen shades of brown and gold. Samuel repaired the east fence, and Tahnee rode the corral horses while he worked, keeping them exercised, and she rode the way the Chiricahua ride, low and easy, the horse an extension of herself rather than a thing being controlled. He watched her from the fence line and felt something move in his chest that he'd been careful about for weeks. One evening, very near the end of September, she told him she needed to go back to her family's camp for a time. Her younger sister, her father's age. Things that needed her. She said it plainly, in the careful mixed language they'd built between them, and she looked at him steadily while she said it, the way she always did when she was saying something important. He said, "How long?" She held up 3 fingers. 3 weeks, maybe 4. He nodded. He looked at the mountains for a moment and looked back at her. "Tahnee," he said. She waited. He'd been thinking about how to say this for weeks. He'd thought about all the ways it was complicated, and all the things the men in town would say, and then he'd set all of that aside because none of it was what he actually wanted to say. He said, "Come back." She looked at him for a long moment. He said, "I mean, come back and stay." He stopped. He tried again. "I'm asking you to stay if you want to." She was quiet for a while. The evening was coming down around them, the sky turning that particular shade of rose and amber it got in the September evenings in the Dos Cabezas country, and the first evening star was showing over the eastern peaks, and there was smoke starting from his chimney from the fire he'd set before coming outside. She reached out and took his hand. Both hands around his, the way she'd held it briefly that night. He talked about Clara, except this time she held on. She said, "I want to." He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked down at their joined hands, and then up at her face, and then back out at the mountains that were going dark now against a sky full of stars. He said, "Okay." She said okay in English, which she'd been using more and more, and it meant the same thing it always means, which is, yes, and also, I'm with you, and also, let's see what comes next. She went to her family's camp for 3 weeks and 4 days. She came back on a Tuesday morning with her sister behind her on the sorrel horse, a young woman of maybe 16 who looked at Samuel with wide eyes and then at Tahnee and then back at Samuel as though she was trying to work out a puzzle. Karuk rode in 2 days later with 3 men. He sat on the porch with Samuel while Tahnee and her sister were inside, and they had a conversation through gesture and the few words they shared, and at the end of it the old man looked at Samuel and said something that Samuel didn't understand in Apache. And then he switched, for the first and only time Samuel would ever hear him do it, to careful English. He said, "My daughter, she chooses." Samuel said, "Yes, she did." Chiricahua looked at him with that long measuring look that Samuel was becoming familiar with. The look that was a kind of examination, not hostile, but honest in a way that didn't let you hide anything. Then the old man nodded once. He put out his hand, the right hand, and Samuel shook it. That was the whole of it. It was enough. The following spring, Samuel, Hart, and Tahnee were married in a ceremony that was two ceremonies. One that Tahnee's family observed, with Chiricahua present, and her sister and two aunts who had come from the family's camp with gifts of fine basket work, and dried mescal and a blanket of exceptional quality. And one that the circuit preacher who came through Dos Cabezas every other month performed at Samuel's request in the yard of the ranch, with nobody from town present because they hadn't been invited. Samuel kept Chiricah's bone-handle knife for the rest of his life. He kept it on his belt most days, and when people asked about it, he told them his father-in-law had given it to him, and he said it with the plainness of a man who is not explaining himself to anyone. He learned enough Apache to have a real conversation, eventually. It took him 2 years to get there, and he never got the tones entirely right, but Tahnee had long since stopped correcting him and started finishing his sentences for him when he got stuck, which was, he thought, probably what it looked like when two people had been together long enough. She learned to read. It took her about a year, which was approximately 6 months faster than he would have predicted, and 3 months faster than she would have accepted. Some nights they sat on the covered porch and watched the stars come out over the Dos Cabezas peaks, and the creosote smell rose from the desert in the cooling air, and the mountains turned from gold to purple to dark. He would have the bone-handle knife on his belt, and she would have the basket she was working on in her lap. And there was a lamp in the window behind them, throwing yellow light onto the boards of the porch, and the sound of the horses in the corral, and nothing else for miles in any direction. He thought sometimes about the morning when he'd ridden through the canyon and looked down at the vultures circling and made the choice to see what they'd found. He thought about what the world required of a person, not a particular kind of courage, not the kind they wrote stories about, but just the ordinary willingness to act on what you knew was right, when the easier thing was to ride on and not look. He thought about how much you could get from that one decision, if you followed it all the way through. He thought he hadn't done anything extraordinary. He just hadn't done the cowardly thing. And everything that mattered had grown from that. On the nights when he put all of it together, the ranch, the stars, the woman beside him, the sound of the land they both belonged to now, he thought that maybe that was enough to build a life on. Maybe that was more than enough. Maybe that was everything.